It's now my pleasure to welcome Kaleena Sales. Kaleena Sales is a writer, illustrator, and graphic design educator at Tennessee State University, a historically Black university in Nashville, Tennessee. Her research focuses on Black culture and aesthetics, and her recent illustration work has been selected for inclusion in the 2021 Communication Arts Illustration Annual. Kaleena is co-author of the book Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field guide for graphic designers. Through her service on AIGA's Design Educators Community Steering Committee, she has advocated for a more inclusive view of graphic design history through the Beyond the Bauhaus series. Please welcome Kaleena Sales.
Thank you, Lishan. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much to AIGA for extending the invitation. I love portfolio review events, and I'm honored to be invited. So I'm going to share my screen and get started. Okay, so as Lishan mentioned, I come to this presentation as a designer, as an illustrator, but also as an educator. I teach design at Tennessee State University, which is an HBCU. And if you're not familiar with HBCUs, that stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. And so I work with students who are building their body of work to be presented in their portfolios. And because a lot of the students are from marginalized communities, there's always questions surrounding identity and like the role that our individual voices play in our work, and should it have a role in our work? And so the name of this presentation is For the Culture: How Identity Influences Design. So I'll start off just sort of introducing this concept of the canon. And some of you guys are probably super familiar with that terminology, and some people maybe not as much. The canon generally refers to this kind of historical lens or this viewpoint that we gauge the quality of art and design. And so it's usually pretty narrowed in terms of what we deem as good design. And typically, if you've gone to design school, you've learned the traditional kind of works of the canon through Swiss design or international typographic style or Bauhaus and those sort of movements. And while those have contributed a lot to design and design education, it can be really exclusionary. It's very narrowed, and it actually does not include very diverse voices. And so a couple of the issues with the canon is with Eurocentrism and bias. And so I'll start with this kind of really basic definition that you can find online. Eurocentrism is just a worldview that's centered on Western civilization, or a biased view that favors it over non-Western civilization. So, think about, again, like Bauhaus, Swiss design, and all of the movements that you really hear a ton about when you're studying design. The problem with this sort of very narrowed historical lens is that what we end up developing is a really as an implicit bias against other types of design work. And so the term implicit bias is defined as a prejudice or unsupported judgment in favor of or against one thing, person, or group as compared to another in a way that's usually considered unfair. So on the left side of the screen, you see these really beautifully designed African Adinkra symbols, and they use symmetry and radial balance and like all of these things that are deemed good design, but many people have never even heard of them. So again, when we focus on particular movements, it sort of excludes work from cultural groups that are from non-Western areas. And so I love this example when I think about bias, and I think about kind of the effects of the canon on the way that we evaluate art and design work because what Kehinde Wiley did in his presidential portrait for Barack Obama was starkly different from what had ever been done before. And if you're familiar with Kehinde Wiley, he's a Black artist. And this is very much in it's sort of his style of painting, but it broke away from the traditions of kind of traditional presidential portraits, and it was faced with mixed reviews. And so some people loved it, and some people criticized it. People were saying that it was amateurish, and that it didn't belong in sort of kind of the high leagues of presidential portraits. And I think that people's reaction to that is really kind of the residual effects of years of kind of instruction and learning that, maybe, Renaissance style paintings, are higher quality than other style. So the problem is that singular narratives carry the lie that, we all value the same things, or that we gauge success through the same lens, and that's just not true. And so again, if you have gone to like art and design school, you may have learned that, less is more. You should go for simple compositions. There is kind of a lean towards sans serif typefaces and flat colors, logic over emotion. And there's tons of examples of how that works really, really well, particularly in corporate branding projects. However, there are so many other narratives and additional narratives that are not included in that. And there's reasons why complex compositions or expressive design or texture, backgrounds might make more sense in your project. And so I start to think a lot about how we develop our design point of view. And to me, a lot of that is developed through environmental kind of taking in our environment and taking in the media that we consume. And so, for example, if you grew up, in an urban area, in a large city, maybe low income, then your visual landscape might look something like this. The textures and the colors of the city might be what you think about when you are approaching a design project. If you're like me, this is sort of what I took in when I was growing up, and this shows a lot of my age, so like don't go and Google Word Up magazine. But that magazine there, Word Up magazine, was one that I guess my mom ordered for me, and it would come several times a year, and it would have posters that you could take out and put on your wall of like hip hop artists and some R&B artists, and it was colorful and vibrant, and the lettering was wacky and kind of crazy and fun. I watched shows like In Living Color, same sort of visual aesthetic, and these other kind of shows and like media as well. And while these things are not specific to Black people, as a member of Black culture, this is certainly things that I took in and sort of was introduced to color and all of these things before I ever entered an art and design class. I thought about also how much I've been influenced by 90s R&B artists, and their clothing and their styling. And so this is the group Escape. And I was looking at their oversized clothing, and I scaled it down to these really simple shapes here. And it certainly reminds me of just the principles of design. So, conversations surrounding scale and proportion can be learned from, this sort of, media consumption, and not always like what we learn in our design books. Dapper Dan developed, clothing for Bobby Brown and so many other hip hop and R&B artists. And scaling that down to just the colors and the shades, I didn't realize I was learning about complementary color palettes and things like that. But I was certainly taking those things in. And another example, Salt and Pepper's kind of color palette here, stripped down to just color blocks, reminds us of, like, high art, or what's deemed as high art, a Mondrian painting, for example. And so the point is that, the areas in which we value, where we value art and design, are sometimes narrowed. And if we kind of open our eyes, we can see that these things are really happening all around us, and we can be influenced by art and design that's happening in urban areas and in marginalized communities as well. So I have a challenge for you guys. I'm going to show like 3 or 4 images, and I just want you to think about your reaction to that image and why you might have a reaction to the image that way. And so this is really a challenge in thinking about our positionality in terms of like our socioeconomic status, our identity, our cultural group. So this image of money, for example, do you have a positive reaction to it, a negative reaction to it? Is that sort of in response to the way you grew up? This image here of a sleeping baby, your reaction to that might be indifference if you're not at that stage of your life. If you have a child, you might feel very differently because the baby's, sleeping quietly, and so you might have a positive reaction. I think all of us feel differently looking at this image today than we may have just a year or 2 ago. So, the way in which we respond to visual language is personal, and sometimes it's just reflective of who we are, what we've been through. And the reason why I think this is really important to think about is, as you're creating work, to remember that not everyone will have the same reaction to what you're creating. And it's also a good reminder for you as well, if your work is not getting good feedback, sometimes the person reviewing your work might just be from a completely different point in their life, than you are, or from a different background than you're from, and that's okay. This last image here, if you are newly engaged, certainly this image would feel very differently to you, or your reaction to it would be really different than if you are recently divorced. So again, things to sort of keep in mind. This is an example from the book Extra Bold, in which I write about how our socioeconomic status can even impact the way that we understand the world, and in turn, the way that we design for the world. And so if you were asked to design a logo for a bank, for example, and you grew up well off or with lots of money, your design might be actually really quiet and corporate. If you grew up like me, not very well off, or first generation, college student and that sort of thing, your idea of what wealth looks like will be really different. And so your choice of typeface and color and iconography and all of that might be very different. So this kind of transitions me into this other like subtopic that I really think is important to talk about as well, which is that, not everyone designs for the same reason. And so we're not all out here designing branding projects and identity design and that kind of thing. And I think those projects are wonderful, like no, shade towards any of that. But, there's so many other pathways into design, and so many other things that really kind of move us to create design. So in some cases, people have designed for just social justice issues. And so examples would be Emory Douglas and AFRICOBRA. If you're not familiar, Emory Douglas is a graphic designer who was most famous for being the Minister of Culture for the Black Panther Party. And so essentially, he was the designer, the art director for everything that came out of the Black Panther Party and was sort of published through their newspaper. And so, as you see here, a lot of the work that he created was very specifically targeting the African American community. And it was to sort of uphold the messaging of the party. And so there was not a concern for graphics, for imagery, for illustrations that spoke to the mainstream audience. That wasn't the concern at all. It was very targeted. And it, again, had social justice kind of underpinnings. AFRICOBRA is another good example of creating work that's very narrowly focused on specific community or specific cultural groups. And so AFRICOBRA was a group of Black artists from Chicago in the 60s, and they felt like they were not being invited into the larger art community. So they created a set of guiding principles that they would follow as a collective. And so they chose color palettes that they felt reflected the Black community. They chose lettering styles and imagery that was reflective of the issues and the people that they were creating work for. And again, it was very targeted and it was very cultural. So this work might not speak to a larger audience, but it serves the needs of the community in which it was created for. So I love this quote by an AFRICOBRA artist, Michael Harris. It says, you know, we're speaking to people within the community. So rather than squeezing into the canon, we're saying, let's make the canon more elastic so that it includes what we do and who we are. And I love that quote. In other cases, identity and a connection to culture can look very different. So Say Adams and Pen and Pixel, I think, are really great examples of designers who were designing as expressions of the hip hop culture. And so Say Adams, he began as a graffiti artist. He was a street artist and he did graffiti in New York. And then he went to art school and studied art and design, and eventually became an art director for Def Jam Records. And creative director as well for Def Jam Records. But a lot of his training and a lot of his understanding of art and design was what he did as a graffiti artist, you know, and it was, you know, where he learned about lettering and color and what colors work together and contrast and all of these things. And so again, a really good example that, you know, you can embrace sort of these non-traditional beginnings and origins of your work, and it doesn't have to fall in line into kind of these like other categories like Bauhaus. I have so many students who struggle with creating, you know, design work, and then I'll see their sketchbooks and it's filled with gorgeous illustrations and lettering. And so I think that sometimes we believe that those things don't have a place in the larger design world, and they do. Pen and Pixel is a design firm that was based in Texas, I believe Houston, Texas. But they were the design firm that designed most of the 90s Southern rap album covers for labels like Cash Money Records and No Limit Records. And so their designs were over the top, crazy, in your face, more is more. And they sort of developed this visual language of bling. And although the designs are crazy and objectively probably not really well designed, if you want to go into a Google rabbit hole for Pen and Pixel, you have been warned. But you know, there's some stretching of graphics. There's, you know, layering on top of other layering, and so. But in the midst of that, what I love about what they did with the hundreds and hundreds of album covers that they designed during that time was that they really centered this kind of like Southern rap culture, and they didn't care how it was, you know, received in the larger kind of like mainstream audience. And so again, sometimes, you know, you want to be able to understand who you're creating work for and then gauge the success of that work based on the audience that it's created for. And then in other cases, people have entered the art and design space through non-traditional methods. And so sometimes just to create a living, and so looking at the work of G's Bin Quilters and the I Am a Man signage are good examples of this. The G's Bin Quilters were a group of African-American women in Alabama who they weren't trying to be designers or artists. They were developing quilts for necessity, to make money, to make a living. It just so happened that they were amazing at it, and the designs were incredible. And they developed these really beautiful, intricate patterns and color palettes that are mind-blowing. And eventually, people started to pay attention to it. But the work itself was gorgeously designed by untrained artists. And so I bring this up again as another example that sometimes we don't think we have value because our origin story doesn't really make sense, or we didn't learn it from a certain textbook, or we weren't introduced to art and design from, at some of the, top design schools, but that's okay. I mean, people come to design from so many different paths. And this is an example of just that. And so another example is this really simple yet lovely design for the I Am a Man Memphis sanitation workers strike. And so the designer is unknown, but the sign became sort of an icon and a symbol of this strike that began in Memphis, but eventually had national attention. And in a really kind of quiet way, the sign asked for respect. The simple underline of "am," the statement kind of reflecting back to earlier questions of, or referencing the earlier kind of discriminatory wording of calling African American men boys. And so sort of like the dignity of the design is really beautiful. And it supported the movement so perfectly, but surely the person that designed it was untrained. But again, it shows that we all can sort of come to design, problem solve, and use what our kind of instinctual ideas are to create really lovely work. So what are the takeaways from some of these things? I would say, one takeaway is that everything isn't for everyone. If we look at the examples of Emory Douglas creating for the Black Panther Party, if we look at the work of AFRICOBRA creating work for Chicago and social justice issues, even Pen and Pixel creating really urban grunge design, for hip hop artists, everything isn't for everyone. And so your reaction when people are responding to your work, you want to keep that in mind. I would take in the feedback, but you want to make sure that you gauge whether or not that person that's giving you feedback is a part of your target audience. Number two, let's all try to make the canon more elastic. I love that, again, that quote from Michael Harris. And I think that we should all strive to include more diverse representations of what good design is and what, the definitions of good design can be. So it's not just Swiss, and it's not just Bauhaus. Those are beautiful, lovely, contributions to design, but there's so much more. And there's so many other narratives that we can include. Number three, own your identity, whoever you are, whatever your story is. I mean, a lot of the examples that I've shown here today are personal to me because they were from, the African-American community and marginalized communities. But if you are from a rural area, own that. If you, whatever your identity is, own that and realize there's nothing wrong with, your work or your point of view or your perspective being different. It really can make your work stronger. And if we look at the example of Say Adams and the work that he did, starting with graffiti and then ultimately for Def Jam Records, his identity, as a graffiti artist from, inner city, allowed him to be an amazing designer, an amazing art director. And then the sort of fourth takeaway is, good design isn't defined by one group. And so that just sort of, reiterates the other point that, we don't want to sort of be fooled into believing that just because we are learning a lot about a particular movement, that that's the only thing that's good. There's so many voices that have not been included and not been written about, not been documented. And so go out there and discover something else, discover some work from other groups and cultural groups. So that kind of takes me into my own work. What I've been doing lately is, working to share my own voice and reflecting on my identity. And so I do that a lot through design writing and illustration. As was mentioned earlier, I began a series through AIGA's design educators community called Beyond the Bauhaus. And it's a collection of articles from like many design educators across the country. And the idea is that it shines a light on underrepresented contributions to art and design. And so there's stories written about the G-Spin quilters, Chinese type archive, AFRICOBRA, the I Am a Man placard, and so forth. And this series is growing, and it's something I'm really proud of. And it's a way that I've used my own experience as a Black woman designer, illustrator, educator, and sort of lending my voice to this larger design community. I've also just been a part of an amazing book project over the past year, Extra Bold, a feminist, inclusive, anti-racist, non-binary field guide for graphic designers, alongside so many wonderful authors. And it's a collection of narratives and a collection of stories and voices, and it's a career guide and so many other things. I talk about systemic racism. I reference the African Adinkra symbols, AFRICOBRA in some of my writings in the book. I also talk a little bit in the book about, or write a little bit in the book about the difference between equality and equity, and how equity should be the goal when we're supporting people from different backgrounds. Jenny Tobias illustrated some gorgeous illustrations throughout the book, including the last slide. And I love her illustration of intersectionality. And so again, it's really pointing out all of the different positions and narratives that we come to the table with. So, how has poverty impacted you, or sexism or ableism or racism and that sort of thing? And, what's your response to that as a designer? The book also talks about theory and history and work. And I love this history kind of section here. And, it says history is a selective set of narratives that have been recorded and passed on. And I think that's perfectly written, because it is a selective set and it's not always inclusive of everything and everyone. And I've also been doing illustration work. A lot of these started during quarantine. And so I love portrait work because I feel like it's another way of telling stories. It's another way of sharing narratives. And although I consider myself a very happy person, I often draw people that are not smiling and sort of solemn in expression. But I've been enjoying the process and doing work that's personal and sort of just fun for me. And so these are some examples of that. And then I've also been exploring some kind of ways to mix in some vector kind of design elements with the kind of hand portraits, but being really intentional about adding in some urban elements and reflecting, again, cultural kind of identity things. And so this is just an overview of some other portraits that I've done over the past year. And again, really interested in telling stories through illustration and design. So that's it. Thank you, guys. Oh, if you want to connect with me on social media, feel free, or on LinkedIn or wherever. I love to connect and talk to you guys. So thanks.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Kaleena. We have about 15 minutes or so for audience questions. I just wanted to invite folks here to use the Q&A if you have any questions for Kaleena, but I'll kick things off while people type in their questions. So on that point that you made earlier, encouraging people to tap into their culture, their heritage, the environment that they have grown up in or come from, do you have any advice for folks who might be people of color, people in minoritized communities who maybe grow up in a primarily white space or a space where they're the minority, and this idea of like authenticity might be different, right? They might not be sort of representative of their kind of heritage culture because they grew up in a different space. Do you have any advice for folks like that in terms of their design work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just being true to whoever you are. Like, I mean, we all have various experiences. And one thing that I try to be really careful about when I'm writing about designers, particularly Black designers, I'm often writing about it from the lens that I've experienced personally and that like my students have. And so that's usually from, um, um, low income areas and or Black neighborhoods and that sort of thing, right? However, I'm really, really careful about making sure that I communicate that there's no like monolithic experience for, any cultural group. And so I think people should just be true to whoever they are and whatever their experiences are. And so if they don't really, if their experience, was in a white dominant area, and that's where they pull their influences from, I think that's great. It's really just about, thinking about who you are. And I think that term intersectionality makes sense because we're so many different things. I mean, I have students who are, from urban areas of Memphis, but they love anime and they love, like kind of like all sorts of, things. And so we're all mixed up. We have all kind of things going on. And I think that's what makes our design work even better. So yeah, just be true to whoever you are.
And so hearkening back to that slide you showed with bank with two
Yeah.
different typefaces, how do you deal with this balance between encouraging your students to be authentic to who they are, where they come from, and also kind of preparing them for commercial work that might require them to have a fluency or understanding of, say, these dominant cultures that might be different from what they're used to?
That is the question of the day. Like, no, that's been the major question in a lot of my, work and research, honestly, because there is a responsibility to prepare students as an educator for the industry that they're entering, right? And our industry doesn't always reflect kind of inclusive, practices. And honestly, though, corporate America doesn't. And so, the design work that a lot of people are doing is corporate. And so I think there is a reality that, designers should be well versed in a variety of styles. And I think there's I'm not one that advocates for kind of the erasure of like Swiss or Western, design. I think there's a place for it. I think sometimes it makes sense to create work that's scaled down, that's simplified. If you're doing a bank logo, for example, that needs to reach a large audience, it might make sense, to eliminate unnecessary kind of like design elements, right? But I think the kind of illustration of those two different interpretations, the point behind that is really to say that there's some designers whose natural instinct is not to go corporate and not to go simple and not to go Swiss. There's some designers whose natural instinct or understanding of those kind of corporate spaces is really different. And that's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge for some people from marginalized communities to sort of like, to make that leap. And so I've experienced that, again, teaching at an HBCU for 12 or 13 years. So yeah, I guess in short, I think it's helpful to learn a little bit of everything and be able to design Swiss if you have to,
Yeah.
but to also not, or to recognize that it's not the only way to design, and to recognize that it's not necessarily the better way to design. Yeah.
Here's another big question. This one's from Margot. I'll read
Okay.
it verbatim. Can you talk a little about the problematic nature of cultural appropriation?
Mm.
I take a lot of inspiration from non-dominant cultural art and design work, but I'm not sure where the line between inspiration and appropriation is.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of people are sort of trying to figure that out, because we want to kind of give a nod to work that's being done, the work that I was mentioning, right? But not appropriate. I think the biggest issue with appropriation is that it typically doesn't honor the original kind of creators of that thing. And so it's really about not trying to do work and take credit for it, or take credit for that particular style, or that, and to make sure that we even just use our words to acknowledge, where the inspiration came from. That goes far. If you're wanting to sort of, pay tribute to a particular design style, you can also write about it, so you don't necessarily have to do the cultural work in your design work, but you can honor it in other ways. You can show other people's work that are doing it, that are from those cultural groups, or you can write about it, but you don't necessarily have to include it in your own work either.
Wonderful. Yeah, and just another example to piggyback off of it, there's a great brand called Diop. I'll post it in the
Oh
chat, but
yeah, yeah.
they're a West African inspired fashion brand, and they have a page on their site where they talk about appropriation, who can wear their things, and how to be inclusive without being appropriative.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah. So, and there's some clothing brands that have done a really great job of that, and then there's some, I think we've all seen examples of people, appropriating styles and even vernacular, saying yes, queen, and all of these things, taking phrases and terminology and different things from other cultural groups, and sort of taking ownership of it, and not giving, again, acknowledgement to where it came from. I think that's really where the problem is. Yeah.
Yeah. So a question from Meg. Where would you suggest starting to look for other resources and sources of information or design inspiration from underrepresented groups, besides, of course, beyond the Bauhaus, for a designer who has a more narrow experience with life?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think sometimes we can look to social media, but we can diversify our social media algorithm by just following more minority designers, illustrators, artists, and then suddenly your feed will sort of start to kind of play catch up a little bit, and you can find inspiration that way. If you find a designer or illustrator whose work you who's from a marginalized community, see who they're inspired by, and sort of go down that rabbit hole of inspiration, go to their page, see, read about them, and then, just dig in deep that way. I always think that's kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of, finding out more about kind of other cultural groups. And then sometimes these things aren't documented. Honestly, there's some missing documentation from the work of marginalized communities in terms of art and design. And so sometimes that work is found not in design books and not in art books, but they might be in books about just history in general, or sociology, or anthropology, so they might sort of be everywhere. And so yeah, so it's just sort of keeping your eyes open to that, and being really intentional about seeking that out, maybe again on social media.
So another career-related question, this one from
Yeah.
Mei Ling. For designers who have a more vibrant illustrative style, and especially those rooted in non-white cultures, where would you recommend looking for entry-level work in design?
Oh man. You know what I think is really awesome? Now more than ever, I mean, you can create if you have like a signature style, if you have your own kind of thing going, curate your, your art page on Instagram or, your website or whatever you're using. And people will find you. Like put your voice out there enough and people will find you. Sometimes the opportunities are kind of tough to find. But I think there's a lot of really good examples. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking out on his name. But there's some good examples of artists who are doing some amazing like illustrative kind of illustrations and design work. And big organizations are finding them and they're partnering with them and they're seeking them out for their unique voice. And so I think that's a really good kind of path to take if you have a signature kind of thing going. Yeah.
All right. Last question. Want to combine a couple
Okay.
around these themes. So basically, it's about designers who are already in-house, who may come from minority groups or have a style that might be kind of pushing the envelope a little bit. How do they navigate some of those cultures when they're sort of like the only one or the token within these cultures?
Yeah, that's hard. Sometimes I mean, honestly, just if you're in a place that, if you're doing work that is very streamlined, especially if it's like an in-house place and there's like kind of like a template, kind of thing that you guys are doing, and it's very streamlined and there's not a lot of room for like creative exploration. You might have to do your thing on the side. That might not be the place where you can buck the system and sort of introduce your thing. That's just a reality of just the industry. You might find a different place that's more open to kind of your style. I mean, and to the credit of a lot of these organizations and companies, they're hiring people to solve a problem. They're hiring people who can do the work that they need to do. And so it's not always appropriate to go in and sort of like expect to like shake things up completely. I think what's probably more realistic is finding a different place that you can explore those kind of creative explorations. But if you're talking a little bit more about just like the social component of being the only minority person, you know that's that's a whole nother conversation. But I think that people are becoming more aware and taking on more responsibility to include more inclusive sort of environments in their workplace. And so maybe you're the person that can have honest conversations with your coworkers or with the higher ups. And if someone's doing something that makes you uncomfortable, kind of speak up about it. Maybe you can be the person that influences new policies, or new hiring practices. And while you might not be able to shake up their design style too much, depending on kind of how structured it is, maybe just introducing your creative director or your boss or whoever you're working for to other work might just open their eyes up to it. So I'd say have a conversation, be open, be honest, and if it's not working for you, maybe find something else.
Wonderful. Well, Kaleena, thank you for the presentation and
Yeah.
the wise words of advice and encouragement. Thank you to our audience members for writing in with your questions.